We now have a result back for that vote, and there are 142 votes to approve the report and 11 to reject it. We now move on to agenda item F3, which you'll find on page 15 of the agenda. And I now ask Michael Berrett-Gooding to stand by and call on Duncan Brack from Lambeth Borough to speak.
Thank you very much, Cara. Conference, this amendment to conference standing orders deals with the procedures for the questions that you submit to reports. The reports from federal committees, like the one we've just had, or from our parliamentary parties in the Commons and Lords. And what Conference Committee is aiming to do here is to simplify and to liberalise the existing procedure. At the moment, in conference standing orders, there are no less than 3 separate deadlines for questions. Questions to federal committees have to be submitted at least 2 days before conference, while the deadline for questions to parliamentary parties is 1 hour before the start of the report session. Now, in practice, we've always set the deadline for both types of questions to be the same as that for amendments to motions and emergency motions, which is about a week and a half before conference. And this is sensible, as it means we can publish the questions in advance in Conference Extra, so that people can see the issues that will be raised during that session. On top of that, questions can also be submitted later than that deadline, as long as they relate to issues that have arisen after the deadline. In practice, this procedure has hardly ever been used. As you can imagine, it only ever applies to a very limited range of issues, things that come up at the very last moment. Our proposal in this standing order amendment does 2 things. First, it simplifies the procedure by setting just 2 deadlines instead of 3. First, an early one, the same as that for amendments and emergency motions. Just as in the current procedure, we guarantee that all questions submitted by this deadline will be asked and answered. If there isn't time in the conference session to take any of these questions, the relevant officers will answer them by email later. The questioner will get the chance of a supplementary question, and the questions and answers will be published in the conference report. The other thing this amendment does is to make it easier to submit questions. So we're proposing a second deadline of the end of the conference session, the morning or afternoon, preceding the report session in which the report's taken. And this can be questions on any topic, not just on issues that have arisen after the first deadline. We know that people often don't get around to reading the reports document until shortly before conference, or on the way there, or after it starts. Under the existing system, they wouldn't be able to submit questions, since this would come after the deadline. Under our proposal, they will be able to. We do, however, want to encourage people to submit questions by the earlier deadline, the first deadline. As I said, this means that we can publish the questions in Conference Extra. And if the questions need some research, for example, questions about numbers of candidates selected with particular characteristics, that gives party officers time to find out the answer. So the difference we propose for questions submitted by the second deadline, the much later deadline, is that these questions are not guaranteed to be asked. This makes sense, as we can only take questions up to the limit of the time we have available. And the other difference we proposed is that the questioner for these later questions won't get a supplementary question, and the questions and answers won't be published in the conference report. Now, Amendment 1 to this motion removes those last 2 restrictions and allows all questioners to put in supplementaries and for the details to be published afterwards. And I imagine the proposer will argue that the evil conference committee is trying to take rights away from party members by not allowing them supplementaries, etc. But this is not true, as under the current system, hardly any questions are allowed after the first deadline anyway. By relaxing that restriction, we're making it easier for people to put in questions, not harder. Having said that, on reflection, we think that the intention of Amendment 1 is actually right. All questioners ought to have the right to put supplementary questions and to have the questions and answers published subsequently. There will still, of course, be an incentive to get your questions in by the first early deadline, as then we'll guarantee you that the question will be asked. Questions that come in by the second deadline, that much later deadline, will be taken only at the discretion of the chair of the session, though naturally we will try and take as many questions as we can squeeze into the time available. It's obviously right that party members have as much chance as possible to hold the committees they elect to account and to be able to question our parliamentary colleagues on the actions they take in our name. And this amendment simplifies and liberalises the procedures that allow party members to do just that. So please vote for the motion and also for Amendment 1. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I now ask Nick DaCosta to stand by, and I call Michael Berwick-Gooding from Basingstoke and Deane.
Good afternoon, conference. I have prepared a speech to make to conference this afternoon, setting out all the reasons why you should be voting for Amendment 1. And I'm really pleased that Duncan and the movers of the motion have now accepted that it's a good idea that those people who put questions to the later deadline in 15E will be able to ask supplementary questions, and their answers would be published in the normal way as those which would be asked under 1D. So hopefully you'll go along with the suggestion and by Duncan to support Amendment 1, so that people who ask questions under either one of these two standing order clauses will then have the right to ask supplementary questions and have their answers and questions published as well, and everyone's treated equally. And I thank the movers of the motion for accepting Amendment 1. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I now call on Nick to summate.
Thank you very much, Cara, and thank you as well to Duncan and to Michael for the amendment. I think Duncan has very well set out the position of why we've brought this forward to conference. I apologise, however, that the first piece of business we're dealing with is a standing orders amendment, but it wouldn't be Lib Dem conference without them. But what we want to make sure is that we make the questions process as simple as possible and get rid of unnecessary deadlines and multitude of deadlines. Holding your officers and committees to account is really important at conference. And so that's why we want to simplify the question-making process. So I really do hope that you support both Amendment 1 and the motion as hopefully amended. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. So we now move to two votes, the first on the amendment and the second for the motion. We'll now move to that first vote on the amendment. Okay, so we now have the results of that vote. So the amendment, for that amendment, there are 165 votes for and 4 against. So that amendment is clearly carried. And we'll now move to a vote on the motion F3 as amended. Okay, we now have the results in for that vote, and there are 157 votes for the motion and 5 against. So that motion is clearly carried. We now move to F4, agenda item F4, which is the Federal Policy Committee report, which you can find on page 16 of your agenda. So I now call on Lucy Nessinger, who will be moving that report. Lucy.
Three questions for the report, so I'm going to move straight to answering those questions. I hope that's the right thing to be doing, and I'm going to assume that the questioners are not here to ask them, so I'll read them out, but please somebody tell me if that's incorrect. So the first question came in from Adam Robertson, and it was, what discussions has Federal Policy Committee had regarding Britain's position in the triangular tensions between the US, China and Russia? This question might have been better to go to the Federal International Relations Committee, but I've had a bit of a response from them, so I will try and say that they have been discussing this. It's a bit difficult. Federal Policy Committee works on quite a sort of slow timescale with setting up working groups and things. So the fast pace of the situation in Ukraine hasn't been ideal for Federal Policy Committee type work, but I know that Relations Committee have been discussing it. They've set up a subcommittee totally devoted to relations with China and are working on a policy paper with the parliamentary team to bring to the autumn conference. They've also proposed that ALDE, the Association of Liberals and Democrats in Europe, set up an extra policy working group on China. The Federal International Relations Committee also have a subcommittee on Europe, which has been actively working on the response to the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And again, ALDE, the Council delegation, were instrumental in passing a resolution in Rome in December, which included the scrapping of Nord Stream 2. So there has been work on it. FERC have also held a special meeting on the Ukraine crisis, and Phil Bennion has been coordinating the drafting of a motion which is coming to conference on Sunday. So I hope that's helpful. There's quite a lot of work going on in that area, but largely it's led by the Federal International Relations Committee rather than by FPC. I'm going to move on to the second question, which was submitted by William Barber. This was to note that FPC has not yet brought a motion to conference on the implementation of UBI, despite the motion F8 at Federal Conference in 2020. It notes that the FPC report states that UBI Working Group's remit is now covered by the Fairer Society Working Group, and can we confirm that FPC and the Fairer Society Working Group intend to bring a proposal for implementing UBI to conference? So just to say that work is being taken forward by the Fairer Society Working Group. That Fairer Society Working Group have a consultation session at conference, that at this conference, and are intending to bring forward their proposals to autumn conference. So I hope that answers that question, and do go along and attend their consultation session. And then the final question is, what action will be taken to avoid policy papers being unavailable on the party website while drafting advice for amendments is available? So I think I totally understand the frustration that might have led to this question, and I think we do want to apologise that the federal policy papers were a bit delayed this time. There were a number of reasons for that on this occasion, and we will try very hard to make sure that that doesn't happen again, because it's not as it should be. So I hope that's sufficient to answer the questions. I think, therefore, I would like to move the report, and I hope that we can vote to accept the report at conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So we do have two of the questioners standing by, and I will now ask them in turn whether they have supplementary questions. So first, William Barter, who was asking about UBI. Do you have a supplementary question, Will?
Yes, thanks a lot. I'll be as brief as I can. So thanks, Lucy, for the answer. I really appreciate it. My question just is to note that there was already a consultation on UBI itself brought about by the UBI working group. So can I check that this will feed into the current Fairer Society consultation? And also keep in mind that conference has already twice voted in favour of the principle of UBI. And I just want to check that the principle of the Lib Dems being in favour of UBI is not up for debate, that we're just consulting on what form that UBI should take. Thanks a lot.
So I think the Fairer Society group are absolutely looking at how that could be brought forward and how it should be implemented. I know that a number of the people who were on that original UBI working group are also involved in the Fairer Society working group. So I know that they will be feeding in the previous consultation responses and making sure that that work is noted. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks very much, Lucy. And I now ask Richard Gadsden whether he has a supplementary to his question on the policy papers on the website.
No, I'm happy just to accept the apology for.
Okay. So thank you very much for that. So we now will move to a vote on F4 to move that report. So that vote should be coming up in your polling tab shortly. So we now have the results in for that vote, and that's 140 to approve the FPC report and 16 against. So I'd like to say thank you to my aides, John Ball and Chris Adams, and we're now going to be moving to F5, which is expanding the use of British Sign Language, and that will be chaired by Beck Scott. Thank you.
Good afternoon, conference. We now come to the policy motion F5 on page 17 of the agenda, expanding the use of British Sign Language. I would now like to call Baroness Sal Brinton to stand by and call Christine Jardine, Member of Parliament, to move the motion.
Hello, conference. It's nice to be back. And I am delighted to see our BSL sign language interpreter on screen as well. Most of you probably know that Strictly Come Dancing is always a highlight of my year, so much so that if we were at conference, I'd probably have tried to sneak in a wee shuffle on my way to the podium. But this last series was probably my favourite of all. The image of Rose Ayling-Ellis lifting the trophy was a moment of television magic and joy that we all needed in a pretty dark period. I also think it's fair to say that it reflected that phenomenon where, for most of us, we either only become aware of an issue when it affects us or a loved one personally, or we get swept up in a moment and say, oh, something must be done, only to let our good intentions slip away again. And I'm afraid it's been the case for deafness for decades. I remember just a few years ago when Penny Mordaunt was Minister for Equality, she presented a statement to the House simultaneously in English and BSL. She got universal praise and there were promises of change. I haven't noticed that much. All TV programmes and internet clips do now come with subtitles. But if you want to watch them with BSL, you very often have to record them or stay up until the middle of the night. Now, how can that be progress? In the media aftermath of Rose's win, there was a massive increase in interest in learning about hearing impairment and learning BSL. The number of inquiries to deaf charities rocketed. The demand for those wanting to learn British Sign Language increased several hundredfold. But what happens next? How do we meet that? Well, we have a responsibility to harness every ounce of that spirit. We know and have evidence from the past 2 years that harnessing public awareness can move political mountains. We can start that journey now by supporting this motion today. Many years ago, I remember a friend teaching her toddler to sign language as he was learning to speak. She explained that this is the point in our lives when we are a blank canvas and we learn most easily. We learn quickly and with the least effort. I was embarrassed that not only had I not been able to do the same, I hadn't thought to try, particularly since as a child, I had learned some basic sign language from the grandmother of a friend of mine. She was deaf. And it frustrates me that while our children can quite rightly choose to learn French, Spanish, German, Italian, and in Scotland, Gaelic in their classrooms, they don't have access to a language that could improve their ability to communicate with their peers, with members of their own community, and improve both their quality of life and that of their friends. And we know that the public actually wants this. They support it. There was massive support for Rosie Cooper's recent private members' bill in the House of Commons. And a House of Commons petition entitled Make British Sign Language Part of the National Curriculum got 30,000 signatures. Next year, it will be nearly 20 years since the UK government recognised British Sign Language as a language in its own right. All deaf and hearing impaired individuals have the right to participate in society fully and independently. And too often, those rights are not fully realised. Isn't it ridiculous that a child who is hearing impaired would have to have a separate person in the classroom to interpret for them? I have a friend who is a sign language interpreter in a school in Edinburgh. And, I think that it should be incumbent on all of us to ensure that those children learn from the teacher. They don't need a third party. But most importantly, society can only thrive if everyone plays their part, is allowed to play their part, and is enabled to reach their potential. We have a responsibility to play our part in making it happen. So let's do that, conference. Let's, this afternoon, support this motion and send out an important message that we will play our part in ensuring that all people are enabled to reach their potential and have the same rights as everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. I now call Vera Hobhouse to stand by and call Baroness Salbrinton to speak in favour of the motion.
Conference. BSL is absolutely vital in our society and in our community. It's excellent that a petition that was sent to Parliament had over 30,000 signatures. And I echo Christine Jardine's comments about the private members' bill in the Commons. But I cannot believe that it's nearly 20 years since BSL was recognised as a sign language. But now, even now, it still doesn't have equal status with other languages. And that must change. But so must society. Let me tell you, using it a little can get you some publicity. Does anyone remember me saying bollocks to Brexit? Sadly, that didn't move mountains for us in the referendum, but I think we can all still agree on the sentiment. But the point is that young people need to start using BSL, regardless of whether they are hearing impaired or not, as early as possible. And Little V says that extensive research suggests that the best time to learn a second language is during the ages of 6 to puberty. I totally agree. And my hearing family has some experience of this. 30 years ago, our local primary school, Mayfield in Cambridge, had a fully integrated hearing impaired unit. Every pupil from reception up learned basic signs and also the signs to every song sung in assembly. Every child in the school, whether hearing impaired or not, just saw BSL as a way of communicating with one another. And let me tell you, it was especially useful when they were told to be quiet at lunchtime. But the key is that my daughter, now age 35, still remembers some of those signs, enough to be able to say hello and spell out her name or can I help to someone who uses BSL as their first language. Wouldn't it be great if all our primary schools did this? Lines 23 to 26 propose a feasibility study, and I think that's an excellent proposal. But I can tell you, conference, that it works. Please support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Vera Hobhouse, the Member of Parliament, to summate the motion.
Well, conference, this has been a wonderful start to our 2022 Spring Conference, and many thanks to everybody who contributed. British Sign Language was recognised, as Sal reminded us, as a language in its own right by the UK government in 2003, but not very much has been done about it. As Liberal Democrats, we believe in the full inclusion of every person in our society, regardless of their colour, creed, sex, gender, or ability. We owe it to the many thousands of deaf or hearing impaired people amongst us to give them the best chance to fully participate in society. And therefore, BSL should be taught in schools as a foreign language. We have just heard the wonderful example from Sal's daughter's primary school, where it was actually natural that everybody could speak British Sign Language. And what an enriching experience that has been. And yes, I know that the best time to learn another language is at primary level. It is here where very young people absorb new information like a sponge, but also the best time for embedding knowledge for long-term memory. And of course, it follows that we should have a GCSE equivalent in BSL. I am a language teacher myself, or was trained as a language teacher. I know how important language teaching is, how enriching it is to the whole curriculum, and particularly now when more and more children's curriculum seems to narrow and narrow and leaves out so many things that could become a life skill for so many people. So BSL absolutely should be part of our curriculum. It should be part of people's learning. It enriches our lives. And most of all, of course, it makes sure that those who are deaf or hearing impaired can fully participate. The Department for Education should commission a feasibility study and pass down the expert findings to the involved administrations. Absolutely, this is what we support, what the motion says, and probably is the best way forward. Christine pointed out the fact that 13,000 signatures were collected to the House of Commons petition Make British Sign Language part of the national curriculum. It demonstrates the widespread public support for this measure. Christine also reminded us at the very beginning how Rose was such a wonderful example of what it means when people can fully participate in our society in the Strictly Come Dancing competition. It is absolutely wonderful to see when people do have the opportunity to fully participate the way they should. So to conclude, making British Sign Language part of our primary and secondary curriculum would be a wonderful addition to children's and young people's education. It would enrich our communities, but most importantly, it would enable the many thousands of deaf and hearing impaired people living in the UK to fully participate in our society. We have, as Liberal Democrats, an unwavering stance on full equality for all, and it demands that we campaign on this important issue. So please support the motion. Thank you again for this wonderful start of the debate.
Thank you very Thank you very much, Vera. We can now come on to the vote, just one vote this time, on the motion as a whole. So you'll find the vote in the polls tab under the auditorium tab. Chris, could you please launch the vote? Thank you, Conference. With 194 votes in favour and 4 votes against, that motion has passed. I would like to thank my aides, Duncan Brack and Chris Adams. And now we come on to F6, COP15 and the UK government.
This is Ella, and we are here in sunny St. Louis, Missouri, campaigning for Brits abroad.
Welcome to the Liberal Democrats abroad.
We're campaigning for British nationals in Europe and around the world.
Local parties are working much more effectively as Lib Dems abroad.
We're the only party that has representation in Parliament for Brits living abroad.
In the House of Lords, whether you live in Europe or overseas, we'll look after your interests.
We're supporting British and European businesses, working together to overcome the Brexit hurdles they face.
Our scientists and engineers are world class, and we want to see them collaborating with our European friends.
Campaigning for overseas constituencies.
Pensioners abroad have been abandoned with their pensions frozen. We are working to put that right.
There are hundreds of Lib Dem members, supporters and sympathisers. We need to do our best
to support them.
Working in hotspots like Afghanistan.
Come to our stand to talk about unlocking the potential of the millions of Britons living abroad who are soon to get the vote again.
Have a great day!
Hi, my name's Elle, I'm Chair of the Young Liberals, and this is what we do.
Good afternoon, Conference, and welcome to F6, a policy debate on COP15 and the UK Government. The motion starts on page 19 of the agenda. There are no amendments to this motion. So will Keith Melton please stand by? And I now call Baroness Parminter from Waverley to move the motion.
Good afternoon, Conference. Whilst global leaders are rightly focusing now on the response to one man's unjust invasion of Ukraine, they will meet in China later this year at the United Nations COP15 conference to agree a global response to the ecological emergency our planet is facing. Like in Glasgow at COP26, where leaders met to respond to the climate emergency, we need nations to recognise the scale of the ecological emergency and commit to act fast. We rely on nature to provide us with food, water and shelter, as well as opportunities for recreation and, yes, joy. Yet in my lifetime, there has been a global decline of 68% in animal population sizes. And here in the UK, a quarter of mammals and nearly half of the birds assessed are at risk of extinction. This motion calls for the UK to turn our record of being worst among the G7 nations for biodiversity right on its head and start to lead by example on the environment. Without leadership from wealthy and stable countries like us, how can we expect poorer countries to agree to new targets? And whilst the government trumpets its Environment Act, recent decisions to allow the use of bee-harming pesticides and insufficiently strong policies to tackle sewage fouling our streams and rivers all too shamefully demonstrate their actions don't match their words, let alone the PM's promise of a Brexit freedoms bill to make it easier to rip up European environmental regulations that have protected our land, sea and water for decades. We need bold action to protect and restore our natural environment. We've lost nearly half of our biodiversity since the Industrial Revolution, and not a single body of water in England is in good overall condition. The UK is fast heading towards being an ecological desert, but it's not too late to change course. Liberal Democrats would enact a rapid plan to halt the decline of nature by 2030 and ensure its recovery. We would integrate the environment into all aspects of decision making so that short-term political pressures don't sacrifice the environment for political expediency. We're internationalists by conviction. We believe that the world will be safer, more prosperous and greener when people cooperate across borders. The ecological emergency is global in its scope, and what happens around the world affects us here. Deforestation in Brazil drives global change. The destruction of nesting bird sites depopulates our bird populations, and overfishing harms fish stocks around the UK, as well as our fishing communities. The Conservatives don't understand the need for an internationalist approach. To them, the natural world is a financial asset to be traded away or hijacked as part of a nationalist project. Whilst Jacob Rees-Mogg thinks fish are happy in being British, we know that fish have no concept of borders or boundaries, and nor does any other part of nature. We would restore our international development budget and use it to provide training and investment for developing countries to protect and restore the ecosystems, benefiting everyone. Only international cooperation can tackle this challenge, with each country contributing towards its means. And we would use international trade agreements to support and protect our own farmers from competition from countries with weaker environmental standards than our own. As Liberal Democrats, we know we need local action as well as international action, improving the environment for people who live and work in, and crucially for their health and well-being, enjoy. So Liberal Democrats would enable local authorities to introduce place-based solutions to the ecological crisis. And I salute the work of so many Liberal Democrat councils, Chelmsford, Teignbridge and South Cambridgeshire, to name but three. They, despite the funding constraints imposed by this Tory government and a developing planning process which doesn't give appropriate weight to the environment alongside housing targets, have done so much to protect our precious local environments. With the right policies and funding, we could do so much more. Conference, I encourage you to support this motion. It will give Liberal Democrats a clear message to their local communities that we will do all we can to protect their wildlife-rich spaces, their woodlands, their waterways, their accessible green spaces. And we will campaign in Parliament, in the Commons and in the Lords for our government to fight this year at COP15 for the strongest targets to protect our precious biodiversity everywhere in this, our troubled world.
Thank you, Kate. Will Pippa Halings please stand by? And I now call Keith Melton from Newark and Sherwood, who will be speaking for the motion.
Thank you, Chair. Line 61 of this motion refers to the Dasgupta review of the economics of biodiversity. And I just wanted to draw your attention to a few quotes from that review. Humans constitute 96% of the mass of all mammals on the planet, leaving just 4% for all the elephants, giraffes, tigers, and all the rest. And 70% of all the birds alive at this moment are poultry, mostly chickens for us to eat. I'm not sure what percentage of mammals our pets account for, but we use a lot of land and sea to feed them too. And all of this is creating a serious threat to biodiversity worldwide. For example, just one example, collapsing populations of swallows, swifts and house martins may be largely caused by the collapse of the populations of insects, which in turn follows collapsing populations of wildflowers. And that's partly caused by widespread unsustainable agricultural practices. Global overheating brings warmer winters and earlier springs to the Northern Hemisphere. Although short life cycles of some species allow for adaptation, longer-lived animals cannot always adapt sufficiently quickly. Putting all of these things right will take collaborative action by every nation on Earth. We've shown through the pandemic and more recently through Putin's war that we can collaborate internationally at pace. But the question is, will we, when it comes to the natural environment? At COP27 on climate change, Boris Johnson said the UK is going to make sure that the natural world stays right at the top of the global agenda. But as with most of his bluster, that has proved to be a load of bollocks, excuse my language. Bees, for example, pollinate 1/3 of all of our food supplies, yet the government has again given special permission for the use of neonicotinoids known to harm bees. In particular, I want to support lines 18 to 21 and lines 61 to 64 of the motion. Lines 18 to 21 say the climate emergency and the ecological emergencies are intrinsically linked, and that there has been insufficient action in the UK and globally to tackle the climate emergency. And in line 61 to 64, we commend implementing the recommendations of the Dasgupta review at pace and ensuring that the environment is at the heart of all government policy making by adopting a set of economic measures that go beyond GDP to take account of the natural world. This is a message that we have been emphasising for well over 40 years, to my certain knowledge within the party, but we must keep plugging away at it. This spring conference actually has a wealth of environmental policy debates over the next few days, and as a party we already have a great store of environmental goodies in the store cupboard. I just want to take this opportunity to make the general point that we must put these goodies on show for the voting population in both the local elections in May this year and next. We must also place this issue at the top of the manifesto for the general election when it comes. We know we care for the environment, but we need to get this message across more effectively to the voters, many of whom apparently still do not seem to know what we stand for. So I commend the whole of this motion to you, but let's make sure that we shout it from the rooftops during election time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Keith. Will Richard Benwell please stand by? And I now call Pippa Halings from South Cambridgeshire, who will also be speaking for the motion.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'm the parliamentary candidate for South Cambridgeshire, and also with Keith Melton, part of the Green Liberal Democrats executive. And speaking to you today because I'm also sit as Deputy Chair of the LGA Board for Environment, Economy, Housing and Transport. And I'd like to point us particularly to lines 47 to 49 and 65 to 67 of this motion, because they're the ones that link the global to national and central government, but then all levels of government down to local government. Because I'm absolutely passionate about the role that we can play at local government to address the ecological crisis as well as the climate emergency. And in terms of the local elections coming up this May, there is nothing more that rouses and brings together a community and gets them out and wanting action than the possibility of losing a green space, losing trees of them being cut down, or of sewage in the rivers. And this is exactly what this government has been allowing to happen. At COP15, when it happens, after the last 10 years, which was supposed to be the decade of ecosystem action and conservation, we're going to be entering the decade of ecosystem restoration because we haven't done enough. And here in the UK, as Kate has mentioned, we've got just an absolutely shameful situation. And in particular, we're doing a lot of campaigning around the status of rivers and sewage in rivers, which is a blue wall seat issue. Not one single river in the country is in overall good condition. And that just means good. Not one, not a single one. And that's because this government just has not invested in the Environment Agency and taken the policies and the targets seriously. Now, at local government level, we've got a lot to do, and that's through planning, land use. We're tenant farmers, we own parks, we do green infrastructure planning, we look at biodiversity opportunity mapping, and outside the existing protected areas, we have the new nature recovery networks. At neighbourhood level, we have local green space designations. These are all things that we can bring together between local authorities and local communities to achieve. But 99% of climate councils have declared a climate emergency and only 15% a biodiversity emergency. So we have a lot to do, and I ask us to pass this motion and get some action done.
Thank you, Pippa. Finally, will Richard Benwell please, I'd like to call Richard Benwell to summate on behalf of the motion.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you, Conference, and thank you to all the brilliant speakers so far. I last opened and closed a conference motion with Baroness Parminter back in 2017. That motion was calling on the government to set the world's first legally binding target to halt and begin to reverse the decline of biodiversity. And it was the Liberal Democrats who were the first major party to include a commitment to a Nature Act to set such a target, a net zero for nature, in a manifesto. Now, 5 years later, the government has finally done that. In no small part, thanks to the campaigning of Kate Parminter at the centre of a genuinely cross-party group of parliamentarians, the government was forced to agree to a state of nature target in the Environment Act, a target to halt the decline of nature by 2030. That's fantastic. And with it, we've seen lots of other big commitments from government. They've promised to change the farming system to pay for environmental goods. They've promised to protect a third of land and sea for nature by 2030. So job done, surely? Well, of course not. The point of the motion before us today is that those big rhetorical commitments are no use unless you have a serious plan to implement them. And we stand at a crossroads now, because the commitment that we have on the statute book could be capable of leading a worldwide change, helping to cement a global deal to finally turn round this decline in the state of nature. But to do that credibly, the government needs to play a full part in COP15, and it needs to have the domestic credibility with policies in place to show that it means business. We've stood at this crossroads before. The last Convention on Biological Diversity targets, set in 2010, also promised to turn around the decline in the state of nature, and the world spectacularly failed. And as Kate and Pippa and Keith have said, the UK has spectacularly failed with them. This time, we need to do differently. At the opening of the Convention on Biological Diversity talks last year, the Prime Minister was on holiday. When the next round of big talks comes towards the end of this year, we need the British government to be there, arguing in full force and in full voice for a global deal to turn around the decline in the state of nature. And to do that with strength, it needs to have set out a plan to show that it means its own commitments. What does that mean? It's pretty simple. We know we need to protect the land properly. The government talks about protecting a third of land and sea, but it says it's already there. It says it's already protected 28% of land and sea. The Liberal Democrats would do differently. We know we need to complete the protected area network of SSSIs and actually invest in improving their condition. Just a third of our most important wildlife sites are in good condition, and it's been that way for over a decade now. We know too that we need proper investment to make a change. The government spoke about green recovery at the last spending review, but the budget for traditional infrastructure remained massive in comparison to the mere millions that were invested in nature. And we know we need to invest in change from the bottom up and ensure that planning and spending decisions at the local level are genuinely geared to nature's recovery. The government again has spoken fine words about local nature recovery strategies, but has completely failed to put in place the measures that would ensure that they inform planning and spending decisions. Instead, it's talking about planning reforms that would whitewash large areas of the country and reduce our ability to hold government to account for planning and spending decisions that could continue the decline of nature. So this is a huge moment. We need to turn things round. We need to make sure that the government galvanises around COP15 to lead the charge for a truly global deal to turn around nature's decline. And to do that properly, it needs a credible plan to invest in nature, empower local communities to restore our natural environment, and ensure that biodiversity is at the heart of planning and spending decisions. I hope you'll join me in supporting the motion.
Thank you, Richard. We now move to a single vote on the motion, which will take place in the polls tab in the auditorium. Chris, please start the vote. If anyone can't see the vote, please refresh your browser. You now have 2 minutes to vote. Thank you, Conference. There were 178 votes for and 4 votes against, so the motion is very clearly carried. Thank you to the speakers in this brief but very well-informed and passionate debate. And I'd also like to thank my aides, Matt McLaren and Chris Adams. There'll now be a short break, and then Jenny Rigg will be chairing the political sleaze debate. Thank you.
Hi, this is Cara Jenkinson, and I'm one of the vice chairs of the Liberal Democrat Federal Conference Committee. This autumn, we're really keen to encourage new voices at conference. If you've not spoken at a conference before, now might be the time to give it a go. There'll be debates across a wide range of topics, and we're keen to hear from people who may have direct experience of the issues being debated from their personal lives, or perhaps have professional expertise that they can add. The first step is to look at the conference agenda. Once you've decided on the debate that you would like to contribute to, make sure that you put in a speaker's card by 5 p.m. on the evening before the debate is due to happen. I call it a speaker's card, but actually it's now an electronic form which you can access via the conference website. You'll need to put in a bit of information about yourself, about what you'd like to say and what you'd add to the debate. You'll hear back the evening before the debate if you've been chosen to speak. The conference team will schedule a short technical check and will let you know how to join the debate. We've put together a few short tips on writing a great conference speech. Bex and Duncan are here to share them.
Everyone prepares for a conference speech slightly differently. However, the aim of this is to provide some general tips that can help you however you prepare. Firstly, some people will write out their whole speech and read it off, whereas others will read from bullet points. But regardless of which one of these you use, make sure that any facts you want to quote are accurately written down and clearly marked on your paper, underlined or highlighted if this will help you, because you want to be able to clearly and correctly quote them in your speech in order for them to give the most impact. Secondly, I always make sure I have at least one backup point, because you never know what the speaker before you was going to say. And if their whole speech is focused on one of the points you were going to make, it can be helpful to be not repeating that same point. And finally, 3 minutes isn't as long as you feel it's going to be. So don't try to fit 7 points into a 3-minute speech. You will either end up getting cut off halfway through, or you'll be speaking so quickly that no one watching the debate will be able to understand the points you make. Pick the points you feel will fit best into the speech and focus on making them the best speech you can. Best of luck to all of you in your conference speeches in the future.
Hello, my name's Duncan Brack. I've been giving speeches at conference for more years than I care to remember. I've been asked to give you some tips on speaking at conference, so here they are. First, make sure you know how much time you've got. The maximum allowed lengths for speeches are printed in the conference agenda at the end of each motion. They're normally 3 minutes, unless you're giving the opening or closing speeches on motions or amendments. That means you can calculate how many words you can fit into your speech. An average person speaks at about 150 words a minute, but you might well want to go faster than that to give your speech pace and urgency, or sometimes slower to emphasize your main points. But if you go too fast, your audience might not follow you, and if you go too slow, they might be bored. And if you run over your time, you risk being cut off by the conference chair. Either way, practice your speech in advance, record it and play it back to yourself to check whether it sounds okay and whether it fits into your time. Give a few speeches and you'll find the natural speed that works best for you. Second, write your speech out in the way that you like. I write my speeches word for word, which makes it easy to time them, but it does risk making them sound a bit stilted, though I think I can usually avoid that. Many people prefer just writing down headings or brief notes or using cards rather than paper. Whatever you feel most comfortable with will work best for you. Third, be absolutely clear about what you're arguing for and what you want conference to do. If you want them to vote against the motion or for or against a particular bit of it, tell them that right at the start, explain why, and then tell them again at the end. Don't waste time introducing yourself or telling them your life story unless it's directly relevant to your argument. You're there to persuade them to vote the way you want them to, so be as clear as possible about why. Fourth, don't get worried if you get nervous in advance. Everyone does, no matter how experienced they are. Take your nervous energy and put it into your speech. Giving a speech at conference is challenging and nerve-wracking, but it teaches you to focus on what you really believe and what you really think about the motion that's being discussed, and it gives you a real adrenaline buzz. So my final tip is, enjoy yourself.
Right, good afternoon, Conference, and welcome to F7, Political Reform to Tackle Sleaze, which you will find on page 22 of the agenda. There's one amendment, which you can find on page 23A of the online agenda. And I now ask Alistair Carmichael MP to stand by and call Wendy Chamberlain MP for North East Fife and our Chief Whip in the Commons, who is here to propose the motion. Wendy.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and good afternoon, Conference. The fish rots from the head down. I use this phrase to describe the Prime Minister and this Conservative government during last November's emergency debate on standards that I secured 1 week after the whipped vote that saw Owen Paterson let off the hook for paid lobbying activities as an MP. And I sat with colleagues on the 3rd of November and watched a government twist the rules that govern MPs' behaviour on a cross-party basis in order to save their colleague. The fact that Paterson himself was able to vote against his own censure was something I felt particularly angry about. As a former police officer, it felt to me like the accused had also been allowed to be a member of the jury. I spoke to one Conservative MP after the vote who was furious at having been whipped to support Paterson. The government clearly recognised quickly that it had misjudged the situation, and by the following day, even before my emergency debate application had been heard, they were attempting to backpedal. Now, I was grateful to receive cross-party support, including from 2 Conservative MPs for my application, and my debate took place on the Monday following. By then, Owen Paterson was gone. But the fact that the government felt that they could interfere in MP conduct processes in this way speaks to a wider malaise within the Conservative Party, where the influence of the Prime Minister and disregard for the usual norms is now a direct threat to our democracy. And it's not surprising that public trust has tumbled to single figures, with polling in December showing that just 5% of the public believe politicians work for the good of the country. This is a crisis for our democracy created by this Conservative government. In Conference, the Paterson situation was only the latest in a long line. Dominic Cummings wasn't fired for travelling to Barnard Castle in the peak of lockdown. Priti Patel is still Home Secretary despite being found to have breached the ministerial code. And most recently, Gavin Williamson gets a knighthood for being the worst Education Secretary ever, having previously been sacked for lying as Defence Secretary. Now, the argument goes that Prime Minister's conduct was priced in by voters. They knew what they were getting, a relatable elite with a limited attention span and a lack of attention to detail. What came next blew that argument out of the water. Partygate. Alongside local issues in North Shropshire, such as the impact of trade deals on local farmers and ambulance delays, Partygate was the issue that cut through with voters. I had numerous emails and messages from my own constituents detailing the trauma and loss they'd experienced during the pandemic. I had a friend whose sister had to give birth alone as her husband had to remain at home to look after their older child. There were others who'd missed holding a sick relative's hand or from visiting them in care homes, or those unable to attend the funeral of a loved one or have to support others in saying goodbye. 2 years on from that first lockdown, the sacrifices made by many are stark. And whilst people were making those sacrifices, Downing Street partied. Unbelievably, the first response of the government seemed to be to deny or make excuses for staff that had they been working hard. Tell that to a nurse in ICU. Our victory in North Shropshire and the bursting of the Boris bubble sent a powerful message to the government that voters refused to be taken for granted, and I am delighted to have the amazing Helen Morgan as part of our team in Westminster as a result. Today's motions call once and for all for there to be a full inquiry into Conservative sleaze, including the process for elevating Tory donors to the House of Lords, brought further into focus this week by the revelations relating to the Prime Minister's interference with intelligence relating to Lord Lebedev, as well as other issues such as the refurbishment of the flat at number 10 Downing Street. The ministerial code, the rules which govern the conduct and ethics of government, must be made properly independent. It needs to be put on a statutory footing, so it cannot be changed on the whim of the Prime Minister. We need a clear set of sanctions for breaching the code. If ministers break the rules, there must be consequences. And most importantly, the system for investigating rule breaking, for publishing reports and deciding on punishments should be independent. At the moment, it is the Prime Minister who decides what happens when his friends and colleagues break the rules, and indeed if the public should even know about it. And Conference, this isn't a party political issue in many respects. People of all parties and none who care about the integrity of our democracy and its institutions are speaking out. Lord Evans, chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, called the Paterson affair deeply at odds with the best traditions of British democracy. The saying goes that you should judge people on what they do rather than what they say. And we just need to look at what this government is bringing forward in Parliament to make our own assessments and show how it is so critically an antithesis to our liberal values. For example, the Elections Bill, introducing voter ID and permitting less transparency in relation to overseas donations, as well as allowing unprecedented political interference in the work of the Electoral Commission. Our motion calls for what an election bill actually needs to contain, and that's PR. The Police Crime and Sentencing Bill, thanks to the work of Lib Dem Lords, the government was defeated 14 times on this issue, which limits the right to protest, fundamental to our democracy. And the Nationality and Borders Bill, deeply at odds in relation to the tragedy we are seeing in Ukraine. The government won't deal with small boats if it simply removes safe and legal routes for those legitimately seeking sanctuary to do so. Simply put, this bill shames the UK as a country. The devastating situation in Ukraine may have secured the Prime Minister's future for now, but the corrosiveness of brand Boris on the Conservative Party needs to stop. It has already prevented us from taking the necessary steps needed to clamp down on oligarchs and support refugees from Ukraine who need sanctuary, help and support now. The leader of the Scottish Conservatives may feel it is right to U-turn on his own call for the Prime Minister to resign, but the Liberal Democrats won't. As I told the Prime Minister at PMQs in January, it's time to stop taking the British public for fools. Please support both the motion and the amendment today. Thank you, Conference.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Can I ask Oliver Jones-Lyons from Gateshead to stand by? And I now call Alistair Carmichael, who is our MP for Orkney and Shetland, and he's going to be proposing the amendment. Alistair.
Good afternoon, Conference, and thank you, Jenny. It's a pleasure to follow Wendy Chamberlain. The action that Wendy took, the speed at which she took it, and the way in which she built cross-party consensus at the time of the Owen Paterson affair, I think was absolutely exemplary. It put us at the centre of the debate, and it established Wendy as a first-term Parliament colleague, as a beacon for somebody who would stand up for what was right and for proper standards. What we saw at the time of Owen Paterson, I thought, was as bad as it could get. But a few weeks later, it just started getting worse. As week by week, another story of another party during lockdown came out, as another explanation was shown to be divorced from reality and divorced from the truth. And piece by piece, the remaining credibility that the Prime Minister may have had was shredded. I'm not going to rehearse the history of what happened there. I think we're all painfully aware of it. But this amendment actually started its life as an emergency motion to deal with Partygate. But things have moved on. You may have noticed we're not talking much about Partygate at the moment because our focus is, and I think this is absolutely right, it's quite rightly focused on the unfolding tragedy that is happening in Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that Partygate has gone away. It would be an utter disgrace if the bravery of Volodymyr Zelensky and the people of Ukraine was somehow to be a lever used to get this disgraced and disgraceful Prime Minister off the hook. So the issue of Partygate hasn't gone away for Boris Johnson in the same way that I can tell you it has not gone away for the hundreds of thousands, maybe the millions of people across this country who looked on with horror when they realised that when they were seeing their loved ones slip away, unable to have the comfort of their family around them, those who were making the rules, telling them that this was just not permissible, were partying on as if nothing had happened. As Wendy said yesterday, quite remarkably, Douglas Ross, the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, thought that it would be a good idea to say that actually, having come out early on to say that Boris Johnson should resign, maybe he didn't have to go after all, displaying the sort of spine that actually would embarrass your average jellyfish. I think Douglas Ross is not a role model that anybody in this party should be following, We said from an early stage that the Prime Minister should resign, and we reiterate that point today. Yes, this is a time of crisis. Yes, this is a time where it will cause problems, probably, if you end up having a leadership election in the course of events unfolding. But the truth of the matter is, this is not the first time that this has happened. It happened previously in the course of the Second World War. That's how we ended up with Winston Churchill as Prime Minister. It happened in the course of the First World War, when actually with troops committed, we saw the removal of Margaret Thatcher. The truth of the matter is that if we are to tackle the challenges that are facing us at home and abroad at the moment, we need a Prime Minister in whom we can have confidence, whose words we can trust. And it pains me to say that that cannot now and never again will be Boris Johnson. Conference, please accept Amendment 1 and pass the motion as a whole.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Can I ask Matt McLaren from Enfield to stand by? And I now call Oliver Jones-Lyons from Gateshead, who wishes to speak in favour of the motion as a whole. Oliver.
At my first federal conference in the autumn of 2020, I submitted an amendment to a motion on the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, outlining concerns about the suspension of the normal competitive tender process during the pandemic. It preemptively called for any inquiry into the pandemic response to consider amendment of Regulation 32(2)(c) of the Public Contract Regulations 2015, the regulation which allowed for the suspension, to ensure safeguards against waste and the hampering of crisis response by the giving out of contracts to firms which were unfit to deliver them. Conference, we've been vindicated in our concern in the leaked Operation Moonshot plans at the time. Since then, the Good Law Project successfully took up the fight against so-called VIP lanes that prioritise PPE offers from firms recommended by ministers, MPs and lords. Much of this PPE had to be withdrawn for use as it was inadequate. Cronyism had cost lives and ultimately compromised the safety of our valued health and care staff when they were fighting a war against a deadly disease. This excellent motion, as we now look beyond the crisis stages of the pandemic, superbly outlines how we as Liberal Democrats would restore trust after endemic cronyism, rule-breaking and corruption have captured the perceptions and realities of public life. The public inquiry must be robust and have all the powers it needs to unearth the corruption that was evidently present throughout our response. It will be able to recommend the changes needed to proactively prevent corruption of this level from ever being present in a crisis response again in this country. However, this will not be enough, and this motion recognises that. We as Liberal Democrats are uniquely positioned to end corruption and sleaze in this country. Is our commitment not only to tinker around with public contract regulations, but to wholesale political reform, whether it be electoral reform or reform of the ministerial code, both referenced in this motion, that will deliver an end to corruption in public life. But we must hold this key fact in our minds as we move forward. It is our unique positioning that gives us a moral imperative to, for example, stand candidates in every seat. Whilst it may be a corrupt Conservative government that is in power at the moment, we should not rest on our laurels and presume that the fight ends there, lest we forget the hundreds of millions of pounds squandered by the corrupt Labour Council in Liverpool. Labour may be our allies in the fight against Conservative corruption, but it is this, amongst other differences, that make me proud to be a Liberal Democrat and reminds us why we should not be standing down for a party with such a different fabric to ours. It is across all levels of government and both major parties this corruption can be found. Only the Liberal Democrats have the commitments to reform and the principal candidates to end corruption. A quick word on the amendment before I finish. I'd urge you to also back this amendment. It forms the bare basics of what should be expected when there are allegations that figures in public life have broken the law, that the public knows, and the most fundamental of principles, that lawmakers should not be lawbreakers. Conference, we as a party have the ideas and principles to end sleaze. Let us remember that with every leaflet we deliver and candidate we stand. Back this motion and the amendment.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And I would now like to ask James Bailey from Breckland and South West Norfolk to stand by. And I call Matt McLaren, even, from Enfield, who wishes to speak in favour of the amendment. Matt.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone.
Boris Johnson's premiership has been nothing short of one long assault on integrity and standards in public life, an assault executed from the very highest levels of government. From dodgy deals to finance the Prime Minister's flat, to the so-called VIP lanes for government contracts, which the High Court has ruled were unlawful, though not before ministers funnelled millions of pounds in taxpayers' money into the pockets of select corporate backers, to one of the highest courts in this land finding that Boris Johnson had actually misled the Queen herself. For all his apparent charm, charisma and personality, Boris Johnson is synonymous with sleaze and scandal. Something must be done. Now, part of the problem, of course, is the system itself. It is core to the identity of us as Liberal Democrats that we are political reformers. So it is not surprising that much of the motion before conference deals with changing how the ministerial code works, to rebalance the accountability of ministers and the Prime Minister himself, who at the moment, under the present system, gets to effectively mark his own homework. So I welcome all of this, because we do urgently need wholesale political reform, as others have said. However, aside from all the political, logical, liberal arguments for a better system of accountability, for me there is another issue here, something personal, visceral even. Because tragically, just like so many others, last year I lost a loved one, my dad. He died suddenly and quite unexpectedly in July 2021. And I had seen him since December 2019. And there is nothing special about my story here, unfortunately. It's actually quite simple, just like so many others. We followed the rules. We were told not to go out. We didn't. We were told not to visit loved ones at Christmas. We didn't. We were told not to attend parties. And we didn't. But it turns out, while the rest of us were busy following the rules and taking the government's advice, the very man who is standing up at the Downing Street podium night after night telling us all to stay at home was practicing the complete opposite and presiding over a Downing Street that hosted numerous parties, attending some himself, and then having the gall to lie about it to Parliament, even claiming at one point that he wasn't aware the rules were being broken. This is despite the fact that he was the one responsible not just for writing them, but for then communicating them to the nation in daily press conferences. It is extraordinary that such a man can remain in office. And every single day that he does, he brings the historic office that he holds, the government over which he presides, and the Conservative Party he leads into ever greater disrepute. And that is why I wholeheartedly and unreservedly urge my fellow Liberal Democrats to support Amendment 1, complete with its bold words, further calls on the Prime Minister to resign. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Matt. Can I ask Nick DaCosta from Haringey to stand by? And I now call James Bailey from Breckland and South West Norfolk, who wishes to speak particularly in favour of lines 18 and 19. James.
Thank you, Jenny. The lines 18 and 19 cover this idea of government accountability in its broadest sense, and a government that doesn't act above the law. And I think this is such an important part of this motion because it's a part that keys into so many of the other things that we campaign on as Liberal Democrats. As has been said, this isn't just, though it is very important, about removing Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson should have gone well before he became Prime Minister and probably before he became an MP. But there are many wider questions here, like Why are we in a system that lets somebody this fundamentally corrupt run the country we live in? But what does it take to have governments that don't act above the law? And as Liberal Democrats, we tend to enjoy thinking about the technical solutions, about getting the regulations correct, about getting the right frameworks for regulation constraining the behaviour of those in power. And this sort of articulate power, power as it is placed on paper that people are formally given, is fundamental to how liberalism has historically worked. It's fundamental to who we are, that you can make the rules, you can get people to conform to the rules, and you can thereby restrain the powerful from visiting worse things on those who do not have power. But we also need to think, as we tackle this, about inarticulate power, the power that comes from networks, from people's public presence, power that comes via the back rooms of Number 10, not the front houses of Parliament. And that's why I think this part of the motion is so important, because it's the part that links it into the wider agenda of things we need to be pushing for as Liberal Democrats, that will not just give us better ways to catch out people who do wrong, will not just give us a better Prime Minister, though those are both things we massively need, but things that will move us towards a society where we have much better, wider solutions. That means diversity. It means having more people in the room. It means not having a group of people at the top chambers of power who have been expecting to be there since they were at school. It means more decentralized decision making, so that we don't have all the power blocked into one place at the top of the country, such that a small handful of old Etonians can sit round a table running the thing. It means fighting poverty, because you can't hold government effectively accountable when what you're needing to be concerned about day on day is whether your house is heated and whether you've got food on the table. These changes to society are about effectively the redistribution of power. And that, I think, is something truly fundamental to us as Liberal Democrats. We've discussed the problems of trust in government. Let's get to a point where people feel that government trusts them. And then maybe we'll make some real long-term progress on building a society that is better protected against corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Can I ask Andrew Emerson from Orkney and Shetland to stand by, please? And I now call Nick Da Costa from Haringey, who, among other things, is chair of the Federal Conference Committee. Nick.
Thank you very much, Jenny. And I'd also like to thank Wendy and Alistair for the motion and the excellent amendment. It's really sad. It's a really sad reflection of our political society that we're having to bring a motion like this to conference to tackle sleaze and to deal with things such as Partygate. It's reflective not only of, unfortunately, the Tory government, but of politics across our country and internationally. In 2020, there was a poll in 34 countries, and 64% of respondents said that they thought elected officials did not care about them. Now, Partygate and everything around COVID and COVID contracts have brought this to a fore. But fundamentally, internationally, politicians are not respected. And they're not respected because they break rules. Now, politicians are not perfect. None of us are perfect. To err is human. But when you are in an elected position, there are certain ways that you should go around your activities. And you have to be above board and you have to do what's legal. I can't believe I have to say a politician has to do what's legal. It's a fundamental aspect of society. But unfortunately, we're in this situation. The challenge is that in every political environment in this country, you have politicians ruling themselves how rules are enforced. I'm a local councillor in Haringey, and we've heard in the news probably lots of stories about how corrupt and ineffective Harringay Council are. It's been ruled by the same party for over 50 years. It's probably one of the most regular councils to feature in privatised rotten boroughs. But you have a situation where the standards committee in a local council is made up of the councillors. And those councillors are appointed based on the political representation in that council. So you have councillors ruling on councillors. And in Parliament, you have MPs ruling on MPs. You need to have complete independent scrutiny and review of what MPs, councillors, lords, all other positions that I can't think of at the moment, mayors do, in order to ensure that the rules aren't being broken. And when the rules are broken, that punishment is enforced. You can't have politicians as judge, jury, and executioner. And this has come so much to the fore with COVID, where so many millions of people across the world have sacrificed so much to be away from their family members, to suffer lack of employment, to see loved ones die. We followed the rules and they didn't. And what's happening here? Well, Boris Johnson's breathing a sigh of relief because we're distracted at the moment. Yet it's MPs who decide the rules when MPs break the rules. It's councillors who decide the rules when councillors decide the rules. This is fundamentally flawed. We need a proper way to tackle sleaze in all levels of government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. If I can ask Danny Chambers from Winchester to stand by to summate the motion. And I now call Andrew Emerson from Orkney and Shetland, who is going to be summating for the amendment. Andrew.
Thanks, Jenny, and thank you, Conference. I want to thank Wendy for bringing this really important motion to Conference and Alistair for his important amendment. Now, Alistair is obviously far too humble to mention this, but I just want to make note of the work Alistair has already done in Parliament in regards to this, bringing forward the ministerial disclosure of fixed penalty notices bill, which would ensure that any minister that is charged with a fixed penalty notice, especially in relation to COVID, would be required to declare that. Now, the amendment itself also raises important issues around transparency and important principle. The most important principle of all, that simply Boris must go. So I want to also thank Alistair for his introduction speech. He rightly also notes the success of Wendy, and he highlighted the drip of the poison of Partygate and what that does to public trust and confidence. We then had contributions from Oliver Jones-Lyons from Gateshead, who rightly noted that this represents the absolute basics of what we should expect from our parliamentarians. That is, that parliamentarians should be lawmakers, not lawbreakers. We moved on to Matt McLaren from Enfield, who rather touchingly noted the loss of his father, and our thoughts are obviously with him in the sad time. But how this, he followed the rules and how this stood in opposition to Boris, who was at these parties and the constant drip of Partygate. Boris is not a credible actor in this, and Matt's very touching story rightly highlights this. And then we moved to James Bailey from Breckland in southwest Norfolk, who spoke to the importance of transparency in this, in the principles of governance. And that's backed by Alistair's amendment in lines 11 to 15, which calls for full transparency in any investigation of Sue Gray and the Metropolitan Police. Unless we see that full transparency, we cannot be expected to trust the government. And then finally, Nick DaCosta, who made a rousing speech in favour of this, again highlighting the importance of good principles of governance. I'm really proud to be asked to submit this amendment and speak to the motion, because it's what we absolutely should expect from government, and I can't believe that we've had to speak to this, like many others have said throughout the debate. So I would urge your conference to support Amendment 1 and to support the motion as a whole. Thank you.
All right, Emmy, I've got you. Thank you very much, Andrew. And I now call Danny Chambers from Winchester, who's going to be summating the motion as a whole. And then we will move to a series of votes. Danny.
Okay, to sum up the discussion so far, so much has happened over the last few weeks and months. So thank you, Wendy, for reminding us of the seriousness of the Owen Paterson scandal and the Prime Minister trying to change the rules to protect his friends who've been caught out. And thank you, Alistair, for your amendment, reminding us that despite the seriousness of the terrible situation in Ukraine, it's more important than ever to have a leader who inspires confidence and integrity. And I just want to just note, Matt McLaren, that hugely personal story about the tragic loss of his father. And as he said, it is all too common a story. And it's not a surprise that all the speakers in this debate support both Wendy's motion and Alistair's amendment. So previous prime ministers and previous governments, they've all had their failings. However, it's been a long time since we've seen a constant stream of blatant sleaze and the absolute lack of resolve to do anything about it. Because this country is built on a simple mantra. It doesn't matter who you are, the rules are the rules, and if you break the rules, you get punished. Now, whether it's holding parties during lockdown, breaking the rules on lobbying, or even the way you're lining your own pockets, Boris Johnson and many Conservative MPs just think the rules don't belong to them. And time and again, government ministers have refused to properly investigate the allegations of sleaze. They've failed to declare relevant meetings and donations. They've tried to rig the system to cover their own backs, and they've awarded honours in a really indiscriminate way. So it is clear that we need an independent public inquiry with the powers and the resources to get to the bottom of the sleaze scandal, including the power to summon witnesses and require them to give evidence under oath. We also need a truly independent investigation system. And at present, it's the equivalent of defendants in a court case also being part of the jury. So what is this motion calling for specifically? Well, we're calling for a public inquiry into the ongoing Conservative sleaze scandal with the disclosure of all the relevant documents and evidence. We're calling for the codification of the ministerial code into legislation to ensure that the investigation of any breaches and the enforcement is independent of the Prime Minister. We're calling for a range of sanctions for those who break the ministerial code with an independent advisor responsible for investigating these breaches. And we want to give MPs more control of the business in the House. So why do we need this motion? Well, since the last conference, we have seen a huge number of sleaze stories coming out of this government, one even leading to the resignation of Owen Paterson. And at every level of government, from the Prime Minister down, this is a problem. So our MP in Winchester is a former health minister. He then worked for a pharmaceutical company. That pharmaceutical company is then awarded a PPE contract. And the advisory board and business appointments have raised concerns about this, but the MP has received no sanctions. It's expected that there's going to be a great number of other sleaze stories still to come, especially surrounding this PPE VIP fast track lane. So we need to show the public that the Lib Dems are ahead of the story as a constructive group of politicians looking to solve these problems once and for all. And these strong calls set us apart from the other parties. So in my line of work as a veterinary surgeon, if I broke the code of conduct as set out down by a professional regulator, and then I lied about it, I'd get struck off. But currently, politicians seem to suffer no consequences for blatantly disregarding the rules. So why should our elected politicians not be held to the same standards as those of us who work in other professions? So we're in support of this amendment. I really urge conference to vote in favour of both the motion and the amendment from Alistair Carmichael calling on Johnson to resign. And if he won't resign, asking Tory MPs to step up and call on him to go, because we must restore trust in politics and in the office of Prime Minister, because lawmakers should not be lawbreakers.
Thank you very much, Danny. And I'd like to thank all the rest of the speakers as well for keeping to time, because we have, in fact, managed to call all the speakers who put cards in for this debate, which is fantastic. We're now going to move to a series of 2 votes. The first will be on the amendment. So when it goes live, which will be under the polls tab if you are on the computer, or there's a little picture of a bar chart to click if you're on the app. Please vote now and whether you want the amendment to pass or fail. Thank you. Thank you very much, Conference. That poll on the amendment is now closed, and I can announce that in favour we have 244 votes and against we have 4. So that amendment is very clearly carried. We now move to a vote on the motion as a whole, as amended by the amendment. And again, you need to be looking under polls if you're on the computer, or the little picture of a bar chart if you're on the app. So that vote now. Thank you very much, conference. That vote was even more clearly carried than the amendment. We have 250 in favour and only 2 votes against, so that's extremely clearly carried. Thank you everyone who's participated in conference so far, and I hope you're enjoying it. I'd like to thank my aides Bex Scott and Chris Adams. And we're now going to be moving to an auditorium break, so maybe go and check out some of the fringes or exhibition stands, or maybe even try the networking. You might run into me. Matt McLaren will be here at about 7:15 to welcome you back to present the speech by Pippa Heylings. Thank you very much and good afternoon.